All right, let's begin. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining. My name is Danail, and what I'm going to be talking today is composable components using React context. Some information about myself just before we begin. So I'm currently working at a company called Material UI. Probably some of you have heard of it, some of you have not. But let's get this out of the way. So what Material UI is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, project out there for reusable components in React. We have about 65,000 stars on GitHub, about 300,000 downloads per day, which results in about 6 million downloads per month. So it's quite big. It's quite important that our stuff works so that people don't suffer. So that's pretty much the introduction. Let's get into the actual presentation because we're kind of limited in time. So let's just first see what we're actually going to be talking today. So the content of this presentation is we're going to first check the current state of the UI components, basically how do you write reusable components currently with React. Then we're going to examine the problem with the current solution that most of us are using. We're going to check what React context is and how we can actually use it. So a little bit of background on it. We're going to list requirements of what we want to achieve because there are going to be some live code examples. Hopefully they'll work. Of course, the live code examples, some demo, and some closing words. Cool. So if everybody's ready, let's start. So first things first, the current state of the UI components in React. So if you ever used React at some point, you've almost definitely needed to create a component to use in your application. So let's see what something very basic may look like. So if you take a super basic component like a button, every React application needs one. Well, every web app needs a button. So a button may have different may require different props, right? So we may have stuff like color, label, some handlers like click, maybe a theme or etc. So if we just quickly glance on that, if I have a custom button that I'm invoking in my app component, I have one property in that button that is color, so I'm passing that. And then in the button itself, I'm grabbing that prop, and then I'm setting some arbitrary class name based on the property that I've provided. So in that case, button color red. So that is a very basic example of what a reusable component may look like. But there's a very important thing here. And the main part is that what we're currently doing is passing props for a single level of component. So basically, we have a structure where I have an app, I have one component, and then the component that I'm reusing is directly in it. So I don't have multiple levels to pass props around. Now that, again, is a very basic example, and that's probably how most of the components are being used. But let's change things up a bit and make it a little bit more complicated. So let's see if I have a structure like this, where I no longer have a single level, but actually I have multiple components where I need to pass properties around. So I'm taking a different approach here. Let's see if we actually need to pass kind of a theme, or we have some sort of a theme configuration in our app, and our button needs to use that. Now, a theme is a very common example because usually the theme is set at the uppermost level of your app, and probably all of your components needs to use it at some point or use it in a way. So let's see how this may look like. So again, if you look at the app component, we have our theme definition there. Then we no longer invoke our button, but rather we have a main component, and we pass the theme to that one. Now, the main component, on the other hand, doesn't really care about the theme in our particular example. It just needs to kind of get it and pass it down the line. So that's what it does. I have another component called topnav. I'm passing the theme to it again. And now the topnav is actually the component that does care about the theme because we invoke the component in it. So the topnav grabs the theme again, sets the color that we took from the theme to the button, and then the button is pretty much the same as the previous example. It doesn't do anything specific. It grabs the color and sets the class. Now, As you can see, that example is fairly complicated in the way that you need to pass a single prop from multiple levels of components. Now, that's what it's called, property drilling. And you can imagine it's quite bad. So kind of the definition for it is that property drilling, as also called threading, but refers to the process where you have to go throughout to get data to parts of your React component tree. Now, as you can imagine, it's bad for multiple reasons, mainly that it creates kind of entanglement between your components, and they're kind of interconnected. So it's very difficult to either refactor them or move them around in your code base in a way that each component in the chain needs to know that it needs to receive props, and then the components underneath needs to know that they also needs to get the prop from their parents. The overall result is that way the code base will become very hard to maintain in time, and may create very nasty problems and kind of limit the usability of your components. Now, at this point, some will say, are there any workarounds? And kind of, maybe, depends. So let's look at potential solution to this problem. So at now, probably most of you are saying, yeah, this should not be done in any way like this. This should be a separate module so that you just call it whatever you need it, be done with it, right? So let's look at that approach. So if we move the theme into a separate module, granted, it's not a module, it's a function that returns an object, but I did it that way because I didn't want to create a separate file, but kind of illustrates the point. So if I move the theme into a separate thing, currently it's a function that returns an object. So let's look at the app. So the app no longer needs to care about the theme, right? We don't need it there because it doesn't really use it. So what the app does is just calls the main component. The main component also doesn't need to care about the theme. In our particular example, it just needs to call the top nav. But the top nav is the one that does care about the theme. So what the top nav does is grabs the theme and again invokes the button, grabs the color from the theme, and passes it down to the button. The button, again, is, as all the previous examples, just sets the arbitrary class name using the color that was passed to it. Now, probably we can even go, some will say that we can even go one step further, and that's to just code the theme inside the button itself. And that is a valid argument to make, but it's also tricky because what we want at the end of the day is to have, so the most reusable components that we may have are basically dumb. And what I mean by dumb is that they don't really need to care about where they're being used and what context are they being put in, or any application. So if I add the theme directly into the button, that means that our button now needs to know about its surroundings and where it's being used. So it needs to know about the theme. So keeping the button as dumb as it can kind of helps it being more reusable. So that's why we're grabbing the theme on the parent level and then passing the props. Now, saying that, the theme, again, is a very good example. But let's say now, if we want to make some, if we want to have some other functionality, like let's say we want to have a dark and a light theme, or have some other functionality based on time where the user opens our app. So we need additional logic basically to make this work. So meaning that we probably need multiple kind of modules of themes, or we need a way to actually differentiate them and load the appropriate one when it's needed. So having it as a module may not be the best solution out there. So we can see how we can even improve that one step further. So let's spice it up a bit. Let's take something more challenging as an example. So let's take the tabs component. Now again, as the button, the tabs component is again a wildly used component in most apps. But in our particular example, let's look at it. So we have the tabs component. It has basic functionality. You have tabs on the top, and then the content basically loads based on whatever tab you've selected, right? That's the default definition of a tabs component. But our tabs component will also have a little twist. So what we want to achieve actually is we want to be able to provide the developers with the ability for them to compose their own tabs component using ours. What I mean is that we want to be able to allow them to basically structure their own tabs using some sort of an API or a state management that we still provide from our tabs component, but they can structure their markup however they like. In a more practical example, what I mean is that, for instance, we would like them to be able to insert some, I don't know, content in between the tabs and the actual content. We want to be able to allow them, for instance, to put the tabs as a sticky somewhere, move with the page, put it on the left, on the right, stuff like that. Now, granted, that probably may be achievable with just props, but in our particular example, that may not be the best solution yet. And also keep in mind that if you use props to provide that ability, at some point you'll probably get to a case where props will not get you there. So you need to rethink and probably refactor your solution. So requirements, you need to know the requirements beforehand to actually make the most out of your technical design. And also, even if you provide props on like custom places where people can insert content, at the end of the day, they're still going to be locked in the structure that we imagine that the tabs will have. So we can provide them with an option to put something in between the tabs and the content, but it will be very difficult for them to actually move that thing somewhere else, outside of our representation of how the structure will look like. Cool. So challenge accepted. Let's see how we can do that. So it's finally time. Let's look at what React context is and how we can actually use it to achieve that goal. So if you open the React documentation and look at what React context is in the official docs, you read this exact sentence, which reads, a context provide, yeah, that's nice. My slides are not changing. Sorry about that. Yeah. So that was the slide for the tabs that I just explained. That was my magnificent GIF. And this is the slide that we're actually looking at. Just refresh this, hopefully it will work. Oh my God. You see, that's why these things should be recorded beforehand. Okay. Oh, come on, where is it? Yeah, there it is. Cool. So, where was I? Yeah. So yeah, that's exact sentence we read in the React docs, which reads that the context provides a way to pass data through componentry without having to pass props down manually at each level. Now, if you think about it, that's exactly what we actually want. And it sounds like this will solve our problems and all our dreams will come true and everything will just work out of the box. Which granted, it may happen, but let's see. So before that, some context about the context. The React Context API is available since version 16.3. Don't quote me on that. I think that's the proper version. Although there's some API that's available before it. But for the sake of this talk, we're only going to focus on the latest available API for the React context. And also going to be using functional React components, non-class components, or and hooks, of course. So if you want to implement this with class components in React, you need to go and check out this, how it should be done the correct way. All right, so what does this mean in the context of our tabs component? Because I'm sticking with this example, it will illustrate nicely the problem. So what it means is that if you look at the two examples, if you look at the one on the left, so what we have is we're going to have our typical tab structure. We have our tabs parent at the top, and then underneath we have a section for tabs headers and then tabs content. So essentially what we want to have is for developers to be able to swap those predefined tabs headers and tabs content components with their own implementation that they may already have that fits their business requirements. Cool. Having said that, although we still want them to be able to use their own implementation, we still want them to not care about managing the state in terms of which tab is being opened currently. And we also want to provide them with an ability of coming like using some sort of a API that our tabs component exposes so that we can change tabs programmatically. Cool. All right. Now at this point, someone will say, talk is cheap, show me the code, and you're right. We'll look into that in a minute. A little bit nervous. But let's first list the requirements. Because after all of the requirements, yeah, we don't really know what we're going to do. So let's just define what we want to achieve. So what we want to have is, we want the default component to behave like any normal tabs component. We want easy out-of-the-box adoption, meaning copy-paste that thing and it works. We want some extensibility out of the box, meaning probably provide some props for people that don't want to go with the extra step of doing their own implementation. And the important one is we want to be able to provide a way for developers to compose their own tabs component, but still benefit of the state management of our tabs component, kind of use it in a way, and then have the ability to use some API that we expose from it. Cool. Having said that, these types of requirements would probably take long hours to implement to be able to actually achieve the high reusability standard wet material UI expect and be production ready for people to use it in their projects. Also, these requirements, I'm not listing here stuff like accessibility. If you add that into the mix, then things become very tricky and tend to escalate and take even longer times to actually implement appropriately. Cool. So let's scope that down even further because we're again time limited. So what we actually want to achieve and what we're actually going to look is we want the ability to change tabs. Simple as that. We want the ability to predefine which tab is active. Some prop or something, we'll see. And then of course, be able to provide the ability for developers to actually compose their own tabs component with their own custom implementation. Cool. So we're finally at that time. It's code time. Now, hopefully everybody can see my code here. But before that, I have a simple React server running with some demo, just so that I would like first to go for the demos, because then when I'm looking at the code, you kind of know which one is which, so you know how it looks like. Before that, I used React Create App to bootstrap this demo, so we're not going to talk about how to actually bootstrap your React application. We're only going to focus on the component part. Nice. So let's look at the demo. So I have two. Granted, they look exactly the same, almost, with one difference. So just to make sure that everything works correctly, at the top part, I have the default demo, basically the one that's out of the box. So I have tabs here. When I click them, they change. And then on the bottom, I have another demo which uses the context. And although it looks exactly the same with one difference, that there's only two tabs, the implementation is fairly different. So we'll look into that. Cool. So these two work. Let's look at how the code looks like. Now, I'm not going to write live code here. I've written it beforehand, but this code will be available on my GitHub, so you can check it later after the presentation. So let's look at this. So the entry point of our demo is basically the app JSX, and here I have the two demos. So the structure is very simple. I have a components folder. In it, I have a single tabs folder. In the tabs folder, I have a bunch of files, and then index.js where just export all of them to be able to for people to be able to import them and use them. So that's what's happening here. I'm grabbing what I need from my tabs folder, and now the actual code. So the first example is the out-of-the-box one. I'm invoking my custom tabs component, the one that's intended to be used directly as a copy-paste. That one accepts one prop, which is default tab. If that one is not provided, I'll just grab whatever is the first one and make it work. So basically, I'm using this to say which tab is being rendered when the tab component is being invoked. And then inside I have a kind of a strict structure. I have different divs, one per tab, and then each div has a label which I'm using to kind of differentiate which tab is which. Again, label maybe not be the best way to actually name this, but hey, I did it. Yeah. And then on the second example, I have a little bit of a different structure here, as you can see. So I no longer have the tabs. I have something called tabs provider. I will look into that in a minute. But then underneath, you can see that I'm no longer bound to this a div per tab structure. I can kind of do my own interpretation of how the tab should look like. So what I have inside is I have another component that's exposed from the tabs component folder, a tabs header, and that one also accepts one prop, which is value. Basically, I'm using this to also kind of know which tab header belongs to which tab content. I have two of them, and then underneath I have the tab content, fairly similar to the tabs header, again with one prop value, again to actually know which one is which. Cool. Having said all that, let's look at what the tabs provider is, because essentially what we're using is we're using that one as a base, and then everything else is kind of wrapped as a nicer public API. So if you open the tabs context, let's look at what it does. So probably the most important part of our component is these two lines here at the very top. Well, some of it. So what's happening here is basically I'm creating a React context. Excuse me. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm creating two React contexts, one for state and one for API. Now, why are they two? Some of you may say that we only kind of need one to keep everything condensed and kind of encapsulated, so it's easier to be used. But there are two for one main reason, and that is basically if you have only one context and you want to manage a state and also provide some sort of an API for people to use, if it's in a single context, that means that every time if somebody has a part of their application where just want to kind of present the state and another part of the application where just want to update the state, if it's a single context, every time they update the state, both parts of the because just components in two. If one partition updates the other one, that part doesn't need render state. You can buy renders. Cool. We'll look into the reducer in a minute. So after that, I have two hooks, and they're just sugar on top of what you can already do. Basically, their main purpose is to kind of provide a nicer public API for people to use. I have, of course, use tab state that calls React use context and passes the state context, and another one for the dispatch, which is basically the API. And then we come to the tabs provider component, which again is just sugar on top of what you can already do, but it just makes it as a nicer user experience when you actually use the component. Now what happens here, I'm grabbing the value from the props, and I'm calling a react.user. Now, for those of you that don't know what that is, it's fairly similar to use state with one difference. You can pass a callback function and also emits events in order to update the state. You can go and check it. But basically what happens here, I'm passing it at a default state, which is an active tab with a value of value. Value is the one that I got from the props. I'm grabbing the state in the dispatch, and then underneath I'm just using the provider for the state context, and the provider for the dispatch context. And of course, I'm passing them values. And then after that, I just render whatever children are inside it, just kind of passing them down. Now, last but not least, if you look at the reducer, it's a very simple one, same as typical Redux reducer. It has a switch statement. Since I'm only going to listen, since we're only going to care about one event, which is change tab, that's what we have here. So what happens is whenever an event with type change tab is being emitted, we're going to set the state. That's it. The state is going to become equal to whatever the action payload is. Or if there's no payload, I'm just going to keep it as it is. Cool. Now, that's our context, and that's probably the main part of our component. Let's look at what the out-of-the-box part of our component now looks like. So if you open the tabs one, which is the one that is intended to be used out of the box as a copy-paste, you can see that it's very simple. So the only thing that's happening here is I'm grabbing the state from the context. And the only reason why I'm doing this is because I need to kind of do some error handling, because I don't want to end up in a situation where somebody uses the tabs provider and then underneath it puts the tabs component, which is the one that's intended to be used out of the box. I don't want that. We want either one case or the other. And so what happened here is I'm checking that, throwing an error if it happens. But besides that, as you can see, the tabs also uses the tabs provider. So I'm calling the tabs provider, setting its default value to whatever the value of the default tab prop is when it's called. So basically this thing, where is it? So this thing. And then underneath, I'm calling something called tab stateless. May not be the best name to call this, but I did it. So essentially, what happens here is, and I just kind of want to emphasize on that. What happens is although we want to achieve two different functionalities that are quite different from one another, and out of the box and the way to compose it, we're still using essentially a single way to implement this, which is providing the ability for people to compose it, but then also using that ability ourselves and just kind of creating a nicer public API for those developers that just want the out-of-the-box experience, nothing else. So just kind of a wrapper. And then if you look at the tab stateless, that's where the main logic happens. So in here, we're grabbing the state. If you look at the return, I have two functions: one to render the tabs headers, one to render the tabs content. The tabs header is very simple. It just loops through the children, grabs the label from the props, and then renders a tabs header by passing the value property of the tabs header to be the label. Key here is necessary, and then rendering the label inside. This one is needed to kind of know which tab header belongs to which tab content. And the render tab content is even simpler. It just loops through the children and checks if the label matches the current active tab. Now, if it does, it returns that child, and that's it. I'm not bothering with hiding and showing, just render whatever matches the active tab. Cool, and finally, let's look at the tabs header, because here's where we actually use the API. So what happens here, grabbing the state, grabbing the dispatch, because I need to change tabs. In the return, I have a single div with onClick handler. And the onClick handler, basically what it does is it emits an event with a type change tab and a payload of value. So that's basically what I'm using to switch tabs. And essentially what developers will be using if they want to implement this functionality themselves. And last but not least, just so that we cover all the files, we have the tab content, which is even simpler. Grabs the state again. And then if the value of the tab content, which comes from the props, matches the active tab, doesn't match the active tab, we don't return anything. Otherwise, we just return that particular tabs content so that we know. So that basically that's all the code. Very simple, and this results into this. Simple as that. Now, of course, the code will be available. I mentioned that I have some links at the end of the slides. So let's just get back into the presentation because we're running out of time. And I just want to finish and not waste your whole lunch break. So recap, we don't have time to do that, but basically kind of did it during the explanation. So in closing, you can go and check some resources that we have in Material UI. So you can go and check our implementation of the tabs component. It follows this same logic. You can go and check the docs, check some demo, which I grabbed from the docs. But if you, so yeah, that one uses context extensively under the hood to achieve that. But also, if you can go, if that's not enough for you, or not complex enough for you, you can always go and check the data grid component. That one also uses context extensively under the hood, and we have a enterprise version for a text grid that also provides public API. So you can go and check the docs and of course some demo. If even that is not enough for you, you can always go and check React Redux or React Router. These two also use context. Yeah. So one more thing before we end. My Apple One More Thing event. So what I wanted to say in closing is that there's a time and a place for context. You should not always go for the context solution every time there's a need to share some state between your components. Depending on your use case, a different approach may be necessary, like React Redux or something else. Also, please avoid setting global contexts. It's bad. We're no longer in the days of jQuery. Global variables in JavaScript applications is bad, with some exclusions. One case may be a global theme. That kind of works. Should be done like that. Last but not least, these are the resources to the presentation. You can check the code on my GitHub or the slides using that link. And that's it. Thank you for joining. It was a pleasure. Hope you all learned something. You can follow me on GitHub or Twitter. Of course, if you've ever used Material UI or interested, we're always open for feedback. So yeah, hit us up and we'll try and help. That's it. Have a nice day. I'm not sure if anybody wants to ask a question. I can try and answer it. I'm not sure if this counts in the webinar. Oh, okay, there are questions. Let me read this. Okay, so I'm reading the question. React Redux, React context looks a lot like Redux with different implementations. Is there a performance benefit to use React context over Redux? I would like to use reduce or enhance Redux. How would it be implemented in React context API? Okay, so that is a very specific question. And I'm probably not equipped to answer it, but you should go and read. So the creator of Redux has a very long explanation, a blog post of what is the main difference between context and React context in Redux. I know that at first glance, it will seem that basically context will replace Redux, but there's one major difference. So Redux allows you to do more than just manage state. So for instance, if you want to have the ability to use some sort of a middleware, not that you cannot implement this using React context, but the boilerplate code that you need to do is significant here. And yeah, if you have a use case like this, it's better to go with a library that's battle tested rather than trying to implement it yourself. A good example where I wouldn't use context. I would not use context if I have to use something from an API. So same as the Redux example. So if I need to kind of update the state after an API call or something, I'll probably need the ability to call an action in between. And again, not that I cannot do that, it's just simpler to use a solution out of the box. Hence, if that doesn't really bloat my code base. But yeah, that's probably not a good example. Also, if I can avoid the context and I just need to pass props for a single level, I would probably pass props for a single level, just because it makes it more easier to read and manage. Would you recommend a video understanding of use context? Yeah, so probably the greatest resource for use context is if you go and read the source code of some components that use it. That's why I mentioned material UI components, because we use it there. But again, you should go and check the blog posts of the creator of Redux. That guy has a couple of blog posts that are very long, but explain the main difference between Redux and context, and basically have a bunch of optimizational tips about context in general, React context. Cool. I don't see any more questions. If that's so, again, thank you for joining. If you want to ask a question after this presentation, you can always ping me on Twitter. That's fine. All right. Thanks. Bye. Have a nice day.